Meanwhile in the cage stands. That is quite a shinobi, you have Kazukiage Dono. Such talent at such a young age, a shame that the leaf let him go like Tsunade Dono. I wish he had come to my land instead of yours Kazukiage Dono. Said the Raikage as he took his seat beside his fellow cages. Tsunade just bit her lip while staring at her blonde longingly knowing how true the man's words were, and no doubt each one of those fools must now be seeing what they had let go after the display that he had just put up. Indeed he is one of my most trusted shinobi and friend Raikage Dono. I still praise the day that I had him in my borders and took him under my command. Said Gaara in his monotone voice when they heard the always silent Inoki speak up. Yes, he really is that man's son. Thankfully his allegiances are sorted out quite nicely now. He said suggestively in a hint making a ghost of a smile appear on Gaara's face. Now that sounded like the man was hinting towards an alliance. Yes, and he's quite the specimen too. Who was that girl that was with Kazukiage Dono? Asked Mei suggestively while licking her bottom lip as she eyed the blonde up and down hungrily. Gaara raised an eyebrow at her gaze and sighed, it looked like another one of those jealous females' headaches was coming up. That would be my sister and now his wife, Temari Namikaze. He said, making Mei frown a bit before she smiled sweetly and nodded, still keeping her hungry gaze on the blonde. I see, she must have some hold over him to keep him tied down to her. She mused, making Gaara sigh again. A major headache would come up if the Mizukage herself set her sights on Naruto. Temari would not be pleased, Mizukage or not, her protectiveness over Naruto was unrivaled. Yeah, that she does. He whispered to himself and looked down into the arena to hear Naruto's voice ring across the stadium. In the arena. Will all the prospective candidates who have made it past the second round of the exams please step down into the field? He asked and watched the genins who had made it past the second round step out. There was a team from each of the major villages and he smiled as he watched the genin from the minor villages look a bit nervous. It made him go back to his own exams back in the leaf where he had been the underdog and was hiding all his nervousness from everyone. Alright, now we'll see who will whom with random matches being selected and appearing on the screens. He saw as the names of a genin from Iwa and Kiri came up and he turned to the group in front of him. Everyone besides the two please head over to the waiting area for their turns. He said, making all of them save two, go back and turn to the two in front of him. Now for the first match Ineki Mamachi and Kashiki Kazama, do you have any questions? He asked and got a nod from the Kiri genin while he motioned for him to go on. This terrain isn't fair for us Kiri ninja, these are highly suited for all, except us water style users. He said, making Naruto smirk. The life of a shinobi isn't fair, kid. He said, making the genin look down, but he continued. But you are right, this is a stage to show the people your full potential and what you and your village have to offer, so I guess I can consider you are right. He said, making the boy look up with a confused smile. But we are in a desert region, we need water sources for water style like back in our land. He trailed off when he saw the smile on Naruto's face and flushed when he ruffled his hair like a little child. Now stand back kiddo. He said warmly, making the two step back and jumped upwards much to the surprise of the crowd and the whole crowd heard a strange swirling noise. Many of the Konoha and Iwa shinobi had their second rounds of heart attacks as a huge ball of swirling chakra appeared in the blonde's hand. The Damara Sengen. He shouted and slammed the destructive sphere in the ground, sending a shock wave all throughout the stadium and formed a huge crater in the side of the field. The genins were confused as to what he was doing and watched as he started going through blazing fast hand seals and ended on Tori. Water style, water severing wave. He shouted in focus as the moisture all around the stadium swirled around him and formed a wave of water as he faced his palms forward and caused the tidal wave to go straight into the crater forming a small lake. The genins and audience alike had their jaws dropped as they saw the proctor change the terrain to his choice in merely 2 moves and looked back in amusement to see the stunned faces of the two. Now there, the problem has been taken care of I guess so no complaints now I assume. He asked the two who shook their heads dumbly and he nodded with a smile. Alright then I will step in if I see that the fight is hopeless and the genin is not able to fight back or is in danger for his life and hold the right to give the win to anyone at any time. Any objections? He asked the two, getting only silence and nodding. Alright, then Hajime. He exclaimed and jumped back while the two started their match. Meanwhile in the cage stands. Amazing such mastery over the water element. He created such high-level water in a desert region with absolutely no water source, out of thin air. Spoke Mei in amazement as she appraised a fellow water user getting nods for Mei and Inoki, while Tsunade was wide-eyed. Wasn't that the special ability of the Nadame Hokage Tsunade Dono? Asked Inoki, getting a nod from the blonde woman who smiled proudly. Yes, Aji-sama was one of the only ones in his generation to have such control over the water element to negate almost all its weaknesses and make it his ultimate weapon in battle. Most think it was a bloodline of sorts, but that isn't true. She said, making all of them raise their eyebrows at the blonde Senju. they themselves had assumed the same thing. "What do you mean Tsunade Dono?" asked Inoki, as there were not a lot of things that he didn't know with his age and experience, but this news intrigued him. You see, the Senjus and Uzumakas were cousin clans, with the Uzumaki clan being primarily very powerful water ninjutsu users. Their skills in sealing always overshadowed their talents for water ninjutsu, and Iaba-san Mito Uzumaki was the one who trained Tabarama Aji-san personally during his younger days in many skills, including helping him to perfect the mastery over water style to such a degree. She explained, making them all quite surprised. So the boy is of a real royal heritage, then to be a part of the main branch of the Uzumaki head family and the last of the Namikaze clan. Gaara Dono certainly struck gold with this one, said A in slight jealousy, making Gaara smile and nod. Tsunade just smiled sadly as she wanted to cry over what she had lost, but she would be damned if she didn't retrieve herself and her relationship with her, no matter what it took. She thought confidently and kept her eyes on the blonde whose eyes were watching the clash between the genins like a hawk. In the lounge, Sasuke had his knuckles clenched in anger after he saw the blonde show his skills in front of the world like they were nothing. The jealousy in his heart reached new bounds as he started going through that those weren't even half the skills he knew. He had been holding back the whole time. So what had he been doing over the past years in the village? The Dobe had everything, a loving village, an excellent and beautiful, as well as a proud Kunoichi as his wife, who was of royal status and high stature within her village. He was apparently the military commander of the Sand, and he had seen the way he had ordered the Anbu around like they were nothing and the admiration all the shinobi held for him. Why couldn't he have that? It was simple, the village was holding him back. He hadn't been able to learn anything extraordinary like the Dobe of his team had. After getting rid of him, he had assumed that the only competition in the village for his attention and training was now gone and he could reach new heights. But he was wrong to stay in the village for all those years. He needed the KS wielding to exact his revenge and have a girl like Temari to rebuild his clan. Temari. He glanced at the Kunoichi, who was looking so lovingly at the blonde and couldn't help but admire the glow she had on her face today. He wanted her more than anything, then why couldn't he get it? He was in Uchiha, he would get everything he wanted like always, he thought angrily and clenched his jaw and knuckles tightly. The finals of the 36th annual exams had finally come to a halt and all was now silent in the seemingly joyful and excited crowd that once resided in the stadiums. Almost all the civilians and dignitaries had left, with just some of them making their way out under the strict guard of the Anbu placed all around the village. The proctor of the exams finally turned his gaze up, his baby blue eyes half shadowed by his flailing hair coming onto his hair while his cloak now sat atop, slung onto his shoulder to show his completely ripped and lean muscles through his cut-sleeves shirt. Baby blues met teal greens when he saw Temari jump up onto the railing, still staring intently into his eyes. Neither blinked, seemingly lost in each other when she opened her arms, leaned forward to fall down freely, her lips adorning a mischievous smile. Only a blur of dust lay awake where the blonde boy once stood, the viridian blur catching his princess mid-air before falling down gracefully on his feet. His princess scooped up in his arms bridal style, who let out a content sigh and snuggled in his arms. "One of these days you're going to hurt yourself like that." The blonde scolded her half-heartedly, doing nothing but nuzzling his nose on her own to get a giggle out of her. You'll catch me, I know it," she said with a small yawn, making him sigh and kiss her nose. She scrunched up her nose and he laughed. She hated those butterfly kisses near her nose, but he loved that adorable face she made each time. "Are you sleepy?" he asked her in his tender tone, getting another small yawn and nod from her. She was dead tired, the harsh work of the past week was catching on to her, now that the duties placed upon her were seemingly over. "Naruto?" The blonde turned his head around to the cage box where Gaara was staring at him with his usual stoic green eyes. "Can I have a moment?" he asked him, making him look down at the half-asleep wife of his and then back at him in a confused manner. He didn't want to, but Gaara wouldn't call him unless it was necessary. But his princess came first. "Give me 5 minutes," he called back before he vanished in a flash. Gaara pursed his lips, his eyes twitching dangerously, hearing the cage's snicker behind him. "He has his priorities sorted out, nah?" asked Eri, making Gaara sigh and nod. He couldn't help but smile for his friend and brother-in-law. Estates. Naruto came in front of the marker within his room, walking to the bed with soft footsteps. He placed the sleeping girl in his arms on the bed gently, who was now completely out like a light. His hands smoothly took off her sandals along with holding her hair in a bun and kept it aside so it wouldn't hurt her. Instantly he saw her arms, sleepily searching for something, and he smiled, placing a pillow that she clutched for dear life and nuzzled her face in it. Naru," she mumbled, making him stifle his chuckles and kiss her head, his eyes looking at her adoringly. He brushed her head gently and placed a little peck on it. "Not yet, but I'll be back soon," he whispered, not getting any answer from the sleeping girl. He disappeared in a silent flash, taking one last longing glance at his sleeping wife before going back to some business that needed to be taken care of now. Suna Stadium. Page box. Hiya. Naruto heard a yelp and sweat dropped at the makeup lad on his butt, glaring at him heatedly. Will you stop doing that? I hate that. He hissed angrily, making Naruto raise a playful eyebrow. He crouched down on one knee and poked his nose, making the man's eye twitch dangerously. You and have seen my flashes seemingly hundreds of times. He told the man dryly, making him snort, but said nothing. It was true after all. Whatever, it is still annoying, all damn blondes are annoying. He muttered, making Naruto chuckle and nod at his childish pout. The man would never let anyone else have the last word, no matter how stupid he sounded himself. So he left it at that and looked up at the eyes of all the cages now completely fixated on him. Yo. He said and got an immediate bonk on his head courtesy of Gaara. He rubbed his head only to feel a feminine arm drape around his shoulders and a pair of lips press on his head. It must have hurt you, let me see. A soft seductive voice said, making him look at the Mizukage looking at him innocently, but the hunger in those eyes wasn't lost to him. I am quite alright, Mizukage-sama. He said, trying to get her off before she caught his hand in between her breasts. It's May, call me May. She spoke in her same alluring voice, making him pull his hand back hesitantly. Of course. He said and turned his eyes around to look at the rest of them. But his eyes did hang on to a particular mop of blonde hair that was seemingly trying to hide herself behind everyone's shadows. Bachan. He called out, the name slipping off his lips unconsciously. A moment later he was pulled in a bone-crushing hug, his head now laying in between her large breasts. His arms flailed around, seemingly not getting any room to breathe in the airtight hug he was pulled into suddenly. Air. Breathe. He rasped out, making her break her hug and cup his cheeks to look at that whiskered face she had missed so much. His eyes widened in shock at seeing those honey orbs streaming with tears. I'm sorry, Naruto, I'm so sorry. I tried to trust myself. But the seemingly unbreakable fire shadow's resolve crumbled down in front of him in a matter of seconds. Tsunade felt guilt creep all over her, how powerless she was to help the boy she considered her son. She couldn't even look straight at him when he came, but the name he had called her with that only he could. She had let her instincts take over, even if he hated her for everything, at least she had gotten the last hug. Her thoughts trailed off when a pair of strong arms wrapped around her shoulders and pulled her in a warm embrace. For the first time in years she felt like she had a family again when he tucked her head under his chin after kissing it softly. SHH. It's alright, I don't blame you for any of it, Bachan. I still love you like my mother. He whispered, only audible to her, making her tears double over and clutching his shirt like a lifeline. She looked up a moment later, wiping her eyes off with a warm smile and a soft sniffle. Her hands cupped his cheeks again in an adoring manner. You've grown so tall. She said, making him chuckle and giggled. A moment later her eyes narrowed dangerously, making him gulp, remembering how angry she would get when he did something stupid and always glared at him like this. You got married. She said, poking his chest pointedly with her finger. He gulped and chuckled nervously, rubbing his neck. That tick had still not gone from him and it made her smile. I'll forgive you for not telling me, only if you give me grandkids soon enough. She said firmly, making him smile. She was still the same old stubborn hag, all right. But his cheeks did turn a bit pink in embarrassment at her words. Of course, I give you my word. He said, and she smiled, clicking off the necklace from her neck and putting it over his head again, patting the jewel for reassurance while looking him straight in the eyes. It still belongs to you, you won it fair and square, remember? She asked him, making him smile in nostalgia at remembering their bet, and nodded. Of course. He said, accepting the gift, making her smile wholeheartedly. All her fears lay forgotten at his small acceptance of her necklace, and she now just had a lot of scolding, doting and pestering left for later. Come live with me at my house for the rest of the days you're here, Bachan, we'll catch up there. He asked her, making her consider his proposal. Ah, what the hell, I'm Hokage. I can do whatever the hell I want. She said to herself and nodded, accepting his proposal happily. All repercussions or security arrangements to hell. He turned to the others, getting to the Raikage, who was still looking at him calculatingly, trying to decipher a seemingly large puzzle. He raised an eyebrow when Naruto stretched a hand for him to shake. He stood still with his arms crossed. You have some nerve trying to shake my hand. He threatened him, making all the others stiffen at his proclamation. He saw the blonde standing unflinchingly, as if not even bothered by his words. His eyes narrowed in before letting out a small smirk and shaking his hand in a tight manly shake. He liked men who wouldn't cower under his gaze, and the boy had the same aura as his father years ago. A man who loved his family and crept fears in his enemies' hearts. He saw that Tsuchikage standing there with his ever-present scowl, mirrored by the girl behind him. The large man had a warm smile on his face. Tsuchikage-sama. Naruto said politely in acknowledgement, making the man's eyebrows furrow in deep thought. Namikaze? He said bitterly, as if the name was poison in itself. Naruto quite understood his venom-laced voice and paid it no heed. Your priorities are sorted out straight, unlike your father. I see, the sand headband looks better on you than the leaf. He commented, watching him closely to gauge a reaction out of him. But all he saw was a small smile and a nod, surprising him. I would agree with you on that, Tsuchikage-sama. I hope we can move on from our past grudges. Scratching old wounds would do us no good. Let's look forward to a nice future. He said, extending a hand. Inoki looked at the hand for a few seconds, as if hesitating on what to do before he begrudgingly accepted and shook it lightly. We'll see, but I tell you, youngsters these days have no respect for their elders. He said, getting laughs from everyone but the two standing behind Tsunade. Not going to shake a hand with me, Naruto-san? Asked the seductive voice of the woman before making him glance to the side. He hadn't even felt this nervous when he fought Sasori head-on. And that man had killed the Sandaime Kazekage for Kami's sake. Of course. He said, letting out a smile and shaking her hand. Her thumb brushed his palm gently, as if sending a small message through her amber-green eyes. It's nice to meet you, Naruto-san, quite nice indeed. She whispered out the last part when she pulled her hand back and smiled at him. All the men looked on with jealousy at Naruto, who seemingly looked a little peeved out at the moment at her odd actions. Naruto. A male voice called out from behind Tsunade. He turned around, his eyes turning cold as soon as he saw the white-haired man who had called him out. Jiraiya. He said, the word in itself leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. The man winced visibly at his little venom-laced voice and complete drop of respect, unlike the others before him. All the other cages looked intrigued at their conversation, knowing how he was related to the blonde, yet his resenting voice wasn't lost to any of them. The Toad Sage wanted to say something more when Naruto cut him off. I suggest we all rest for today now that we have all been introduced. My wife has made sure that all your arrangements are suited to everyone's needs personally, so I think you all would be pleased. We can talk this out tomorrow at a small dinner if that is fine with everyone. He asked and got instant nods from the five shadows, all happy with his words, and let all the events of the day sink in. Naruto put a hand forward to Tsunade with a smile, who instantly got a hint and put her own in his, stepping forward when her shoulder was clasped tightly. Tsunade, do you think it is wise? You are going to? Said the Toad Sage when his hand was slapped away roughly. I have already accepted Namikaze-san's proposal, Jiraiya, and it would be quite rude if I broke my word now. She said coldly, making him wince yet again at the sudden new iciness in her voice, even harsher than before. But what about the security measures we set up? He tried to make her see reason and avoid her going to his house, but her eyes narrowed in on the man dangerously. Are you saying I would be unsafe in the residence of the man who seemingly looks after the security measures of the whole Hidden Sand village? That is some accusation to our seemingly allies. She asked him dangerously, and he pulled his hand back, pursing his lips. She was dead set on going and nothing would change her mind now. That much he knew. Alright, I'll notify everyone of your new place of residence, but I should come with you. He said before he was cut off by Naruto. I apologize, Jiraiya, but I have no more room in my house other than the one I offered your Hokage. He said coldly, making the Toad Sage look at his one-time apprentice with hurt-filled eyes, before begrudgingly vanishing in a smokeless shunshin. The rest of the cages did the same, with Gaara staying a while longer than the others to look at Naruto with eyes holding a hint of concern for him. The blonde smiled at his brother and waved his hand dismissively. It's alright, Gaara, no need to worry, I'm with my family. He said, making the man nod. Tsunade's heart warmed up at hearing him refer to her as family, and she wanted to crush him to death in her arms, but held herself back. Gaara stood silently for a moment before nodding. Very well then, I'll see you tomorrow. He said and disappeared in a wisp of sand. Naruto did the same and flashed away straight to his home. Estates. Naruto flashed in front of the main gate of his house, purposefully to let her get used to it. This is your house? Tsunade asked softly, making him nod. She looked at it affectionately, it was so much better than anything he ever lived at the rundown apartment back in the Leaf. Naruto could see her wallowing in guilt and took a hold of her hand to pull her in. Tsunade saw the lush gardens in the house, making her quite surprised at the greenery in a seemingly arid region. He even had a small koi fish pond to the side. He walked her in, closing the door behind him. She put her sandals aside and followed him into the living room, where he motioned for her to the large and comfy couch. She sat and looked around in amazement, it was so luxurious. Naruto rummaged through the shelves to look for something for her to drink. I'm sorry, Bachan, I would have offered you some fine sake, but my princess drank all our stock out a couple of days ago, in one go. He whispered to himself with a smile, making her shake her head. She wasn't in any mood for sake anyways. Naruto has no need for formalities. She said, feeling like a guest herself, but he would have none of it. She watched a new plate of the half-ate-out cake with a hungry gaze, it looked so alluring. Naruto chuckled seeing her hunger and she smiled sheepishly like a child caught stealing a cookie jar. Naruto cut a generous slice of the black velvet cake he had baked a couple of nights ago for his princess and Tsunade took it happily, moaning in delight when she put a bite in her mouth. "Bakers in Suno are great, I see," she said, pulling out another bite and he smiled in amusement at her words. "I baked it," he said and laughed when she choked and patted her chest. He held out a glass of milk for her that she gulped down to make the choke go away. Well, he must have picked up a few skills along the way since she didn't ever remember him being this good at baking. Though he had always had a fine hand at cooking from what she remembered so it wasn't surprising. "How's Shizune-chan?" he asked suddenly, making her look at her plate sadly. "She misses you dearly Naruto, we both did until today that is," she said, making him sit by her side and put her head on his shoulder in a one-armed hug. "I missed you too, you were one of the only ones I missed," he said, rubbing her arm in a soothing manner. "How have you been Naruto?" she asked him with all the curiosity of the world making him fall silent for a moment, pondering on how to answer such a twisted question in a seemingly simple manner. "Happier than ever before Ba-chan," he said, making her smile a happy sad smile. "I have a girl that loves me, her brothers, that are brothers in all but blood to me. People here respect me and look at me as one of their own after years of seeing me around them. The shinobi too respect me, not for my position or my status, but for who I am. It was what I had wanted since I was a child, acceptance," he said, making her nod shamefully. He had gotten the things he had longed for in a new village, instead his home-born village had scorned and spitted on him day after day. And he looked so happy too, it made her quite happy herself. "I'm glad," she said, putting her hand on his lap and squeezing it for reassurance. The cake and the rest of the world all but lay forgotten as they started exchanging their tales of what had been going on with the other in their lives straight through the night. Next morning. Temari walked downstairs, her hair done up in a ponytail after her shower. She was clad in her furry pajamas and Naruto's oversized black t-shirt and was quite annoyed right now. Her husband had apparently stayed the night out somewhere after putting her to bed. She was going to have a stern talking to when he came home. Her rant trailed off at seeing the sight in front of her. Naruto and Tsunade were there on the couch, with Naruto's arms still safely around her shoulders and she had her face tucked on his shoulder. They had fallen asleep midway through their catching up exercise and currently Temari found it completely adorable. The two looked like a lost mother-son duo meeting after years. Which could be called true in this case as cheesy as it sounded to anyone else. She tiptoed her way towards the kitchen to prepare herself some coffee and didn't have the heart to wake the two up. She was still surprised that Tsunade had come to their house, but she was fine with it after all, she was one of the only ones she found pleasant from the leaf these days. Both Naruto and Tsunade's noses twitched in unison, making it quite comical to see when their eyes flickered open to see 2 mugs of steaming coffee and slices of meat pies lying in front of them. Naruto smiled seeing his princess sitting on the armchair with her own mug on her lips with closed eyes. Tsunade couldn't help but smile when she saw the two look at each other lovingly. She was glad he had found such a lovely girl for himself who had the heart to stand up to the world if it came down to it. They ate in silence, quite comfortable in fact, and Tsunade didn't remember a time in all the past years in the leaf that she had felt so much at home. It made her heart sore that she had finally found him and her fears for his whereabouts now lay down to rest. She now knew most of what had happened after their talks last night, but there were still some things he had to know. "Naruto," she said in her serious Hokage voice, making him turn his eyes to her in focus and place the mug down on the table. "The leaf now knows you're alive and all your truths have now been revealed to the world too," she said and he nodded, not seeing her point. "They would want you back," she said firmly, already knowing how those leeches back in the council worked after all these years of them sucking the village dry of its life. She saw disbelief stretched across their faces, Naruto for one didn't have any words at her proclamation. But Temari was as blunt as always. "You seriously think after all they've done to my Naru, he'll even consider seeing the leaf's walls let alone return? No offense?" She asked her incredulously and Tsunade shook her head, not shocked at all. Instead already expecting this. "None taken. But I know how their minds work, now that they know you're alive, they would want you for what you now hold," she said, making a realization dawn over his face. Temari was still confused, what more could they want from him? Naruto had forgotten to tell her about all that his parents had left for him, seemingly having no monetary problems here in Suna to even think back to it. "My parents' fortunes," he said, rubbing his forehead tiredly seeing her point. "What fortunes do Naruto have?" Temari asked, oblivious to the whole affair. Naruto couldn't help but think how stupid he was to forget a thing like this, but he had never kept money in his mind, ever since he was a child anyways. Tsunade decided to clear up her obliviousness. His mother Kushina Uzumaki was the heiress to the Whirlpool village and the Uzumaki clan. She explained and Temari nodded, already knowing that much. So the entire sealed island of the land of eddies and whirlpools now belongs to Naruto, along with all the fortunes left behind by the Uzumaki clan before its destruction. That all eyes sealed in the ruins of Yasushi Agakure no Sato, untouchable to anyone, but of the blood of the royal family of the village, whose last descendant is. She trailed off, letting the girl fill in the blanks. Naruto. She whispered looking at his apologetic face and looked at him with eyes that promised pain later on for not telling her all this. Tsunade enjoyed seeing his plight, but she was far from finished. And Minato's fortunes too. She said, this time a surprise came from Naruto. He wasn't aware of this. What fortunes? He asked, obviously making her smile and nod, already knowing this. Minato was a great man with a seemingly much too sharp mind, a really sharp one when it came to businesses and ownership. She explained, making him shocked. I know you don't know of this Naruto, but Sandaime cleared up all traces that could be traced back to the Namika's name as soon as he died and spread it all up into various accounts in the Fire Daimyo's personal vaults. All of them lay sealed there, untouched for years, and collecting interests and all the rents of the lands he owned in his lifetime and left behind. She explained, remembering finding the Sandaime's will in the Hokage vault with instructions to tell Naruto of this when he was of the age of 18 or became a, whichever came first, so that he may inherit it when the time came. Naruto's face showed his shock, making Tsunade smile sadly. Sarutobi-sensei loved you a lot, Naruto. But his age finally caught up to him in his later years, he did all that he could for you, but the council had wormed its way into each of his departments sneakily, and there was only so much he could do all alone all the while managing the aftershocks of the Iubi attack and the crippled forces he had to deal with while maintaining all the secrets around himself. But in the end he made sure to stash it all away under lock and key so that no one but its rightful owner can lay a finger on even a single penny apart from its heir. She said, making him smile and nod. He remembered all that the old man had done for him, from forcing the orphanage to take care of him by force and under his own personal eyes, before all the hate became too much for him and he had begged the man to stay alone. How much is it? Temari asked worriedly to gauge the political issues that would ensue now that everything was out and about. Tsunade herself rubbed her forehead of the oncoming migraine. No one knows the exact amounts or what he owned apart from the Sandaime, Yondaime and the daimyo guarding it all himself. But I do know that the lands holding the main shopping districts in Konoha, along with half its resident lands, pay their rents for the lands to accounts that lead to the fire capital. Tsunade trailed off tiredly, making Temari turn shell-shocked. But that means. She whispered in shock realizing what he owned now. Yes, Naruto now owns half the resident land in the village, along with its shopping nerve centers. The money that Minato made as a shinobi and a Hokage along with the rents to the lands and their interests combined give him enough power to rumble up the fire capital quite a bit and effectively. Cripple Konoha's entire financial structure should he want to. She said blankly, she had half a mind to tell him to do it and be done with it. But she knew he wouldn't, it would make him no different from those bastards back in the village. Both women's eyes turned to the blonde boy who had fallen completely silent after hearing the things he had just now heard. But one thing lay on his mind above all else. So I would have to come back to the village to settle this all I presume? He asked Tsunade, and the venom in his voice wasn't lost at Tsunade who nodded sadly. Yes, the Fire Daimyo himself would come to meet the heir to the most powerful family in the village personally. An invitation from him isn't one to be ignored as much as you would think otherwise, Naruto. She answered him, making him nod. He wrapped his arms around his wife who came straight onto his lap in a hug, seeing him in so much trouble, and pecked his lips softly. It'll be alright, I'll be with you, Kay. She asked him softly, making him smile and nod with a sigh. No one saw the small puff of smoke behind them in the hallways of his home. In a simple hotel room. Sasuke lay on his bed, seemingly in deep thought at what he had learned. The hatred within his heart touched new heights, he promised himself he would take all that the blonde now held dear away from him by force. Especially his wife, but for that he needed a person who would help him achieve his goals and give him the needed power to take out the two people he wanted to remove in his life. His hands brushed the nip of his neck and he let out a bloodthirsty smirk. Soon Naruto, I'll have Temari and all that you hold here in my palms and I will have achieved truly what I have desired for all these years. He whispered to seemingly nobody in his room. The pale fingers of dawn peered in from the window, bathing the entire room in its illuminating radiance. There was no ringing of alarm this morning, nor had there been any need for one. Both the house's residents had prior engagements to tend to, ones that had been made weeks beforehand for that matter. Feeling the soft brush of lips on his neck, Naruto smiled, lightly stroking his slumbering wife's lovely hair. Last night was amazing. Looking down, surprised to see her awake so early, loving azure eyes stared into sleepy teals for a moment too long, taking his time to appreciate the beauty he had been adrift from for the past few weeks. Naruto flicked a lock of hair tickling her eyelash. It was, wasn't it? He murmured softly. Temari said nothing in reply, opting to smile dreamily and snuggle her face on his chest instead. She was already quite aware that the two of them had a rather lively bedroom life, but the events of last night had shattered the boundaries of its realms quite literally. How many times was it, 6 right? Her voice was low, she seemed almost shy to ask it out loud. Smiling, Naruto placed a loving peck on top of her head. 7. Her finger traced his chest line before rotating in concentric circles, teeth gnawing away nervously at her lip. Do you think, you know? She blushed, unable to say or even look at him anymore from sheer embarrassment. Words didn't need to be spoken for Naruto to catch her drift, he smiled. I think so, yes. But we'll keep trying just to be sure. He whispered knavishly. She giggled, bonking his chest playfully when she realized just what it was he was insinuating. Pervert. She mumbled. Naruto raised an amused eyebrow hearing her soft mumble. I am serious, you know. His palm cupped her cheek, making her face up to him for a deep kiss. She broke it off before things got heated up, frowning with a gasp. I'm still sore. She pouted. He flipped her over, earning a squeal of delight from his princess, before his head mysteriously vanished into the blanket. I can help you with that. He said. Her face ranged from being confused to one of horrified realization a second too late. He had already found his spot by then. She moaned loudly, ah. Throwing her face aside, cheeks flushed, Temari grabbed the sheets tightly within her fists as her resolve to keep him off of her kept crumbling into oblivion. Her arms reached into her blanket, cradling his head between her legs. More. Needless to say, breakfast was not served to the couple that morning. Tsunade walked up to the door after hearing a knock. It honestly felt quite weird to receive a guest for a place she was staying as a guest herself. But it made her happy too, a small part of her wished she could do this every day, wake up in the morning without a hangover, knowing there was a family waiting for her in the house. It made her feel cherished. Opening the door, she was a bit startled seeing exactly who it was, Kazuki Dono. She greeted, nodding politely. Her greeting was returned with a polite nod of his own. Hokage Dono. He started monotonously. May I? The buxom blonde Cage blushed and moved aside with a start. Of course, where are my manners? Closing the door behind her, she followed Gaara to the living room, all the while noting his little actions. He was tending to photo frames and flower vases as he trudged, as if he had done this chore 1,000 times. It made her take note of how familiar he seemed to this estate. A pang of envy sliced her heart at that. Naruto and Temari. She drawled, wondering just how it was she would make him excuse the couple for not being present to receive them. Her cheeks flamed a dark tinge of pink, remembering quite vividly the moans that had reverberated in her room a floor down from the master bedroom, and what reason there must have been for such voices. I know. Oh. Her flush increased twofold for what she was about to ask. Is this, you know, a common occurrence? Gaara raised an eyebrow, bemused, and started gathering the kettle to make some coffee. He nodded, yes. Those two go at it like rabbits once a vacation pops up every now and then. I made the mistake of staying the night once, it was winter as I recall, and I'd rather not be scarred any more than my life has already done for me. By the time he had finished his blunt reminiscence of memories, Tsunade was flushing like a volcano. It seemed the man did have rather keen words for such things. Right. She coughed uncomfortably. A thick tension settled between the two, while Gaara focused on preparing his morning beverage. Tsunade sat there with absolutely no idea what to say. Relations between her and him were scarcely political at best, hostile at worst. She'd rather prefer it if it wasn't the latter. You want some? He asked. Tsunade forced out a strained smile. Yes. He nodded without gazing back, going back to adding some freshly ground beans in the pot. Do you come here often? She queried curiously, a small attempt at initiating a conversation. He nodded, yes, they have rather nice coffee. Tsunade's sweat dropped. Yeah, right. She muttered, a bit peeved at his unusually curt answers. He didn't seem particularly invested in the conversation, neither was she willing to push her boundaries with their already strained relationship. Gaara pulled off the kettle and came into the living room with two costly-looking black emblazoned cups, filling them both gracefully before seating himself in front of her. He settled into the couch, crossing a leg over his thigh, while bringing his cup to his lips for a sip. Those intimidating eyes of his boring holes in her face weren't lost to the usually chirpy Senju. She settled back herself, mirroring his seating style, but closed her eyes shut in order to avoid his subtle glare. Sipping a little of the beverage herself, she moaned in delight, this is good coffee. Hokage Dono. His cold voice made her stop and she eyed him warily. Both settled down their steaming mugs in unison, the situation now turning serious. I do not particularly like your stay here at my sister's house, for reasons I'd rather not say. She said nothing, inwardly relieved for his rather blunt and frigid attitude to any human being in general, as opposed to his sister's rather lively yet undecipherable diplomatic charm. Both were poles apart in personalities, at least to her, but. He stopped for a moment while his eyes flickered in uncertainty, as if pondering over to search for the right words. Since Naruto sees you as a mother of sorts, his trust is all I need. I welcome you here not as the Hokage but as Naruto's endeared guest. Tsunade rested her elbow on the armrest, nestling her cheek in her palm with a tender smile. You are rather mature in choosing words, especially given your age. I must say Kazuki Dono. She complimented him, which the red-haired boy took with a grain of salt. It was true though, indirectly pointing to her that she was welcome in his village only due to her proximity with his friend and not as the Hokage meant that he would rather have not invited the Leaf at all than have their large numbers run around his village while his men were kept busy keeping eyes on them. Did you wish to converse with me on something particular? I did. She nodded and once more pulled the cup to her lips. What will the Leaf do now that Naruto's existence has been revealed to the world? Humming, Tsunade rested the cup on her table, contently crossing her fingers to hide her lips. Whatever I say next, I say as an ambassador to the Leaf. I want to make this point crystal clear before saying anything, no offense. None taken. Very well then. Sighing, Tsunade pondered over her situation for a moment before nodding. You did not just reveal his existence yesterday, rather you revealed his heritage to the world. The names Namikaze and Uzumaki in general hold some weight in the eyes of the world, especially the ones who do know their histories rather well. She surmised, earning a slight frown from him. I do not understand. Laughing shamelessly, she shook her head. I would be surprised if you did. She chortled, his frown deepened into a full-blown scowl. The Uzumakis were wiped off by the joint efforts of Kurigakure, Kumagakure, and Iwagakure. Namikaze Minato wiped off legions of Iwa and Kumo's forces in the Third Great Ninja War. Now most might not be aware of this for various reasons, but that Tsuchikage did not surrender to the Sandaime Hokage to end the war. Her recital took a pause with a sharp intake of breath. Gaara's face of confusion was all she needed to know that he wasn't that well versed in history as a veteran might have been. From Tenba no Noki laid his arms down to Minato Namikaze, not the present Hokage. When he saw 1,000 of his best ninjas' corpses lying in front of his eyes for the second time, Iwagakure had never faced such humiliation before then, and with the fourth's untimely demise, they thought it would never come to pass again. My predecessor was rather non-indulgent when it came to Naruto's heritage being known for reasons you can see, even I wasn't aware of their identities for sure before yesterday, if that says something to you. She recited her history lesson, one that Gaara absorbed in with the thirst of a sponge. These events were never documented for him to read on, these were the things only veterans who were present to witness these sights must have known. Even in such deep musings Gaara had to wonder, how much did Naruto know? Knowing him, possibly a lot. I swear he does these things to annoy me. His mutter befuddled Tsunade to no end, but he dismissed it with a subtle wave of his hand. What does this have to do with the present? She smiled at his naivety. With his father's name, his mother's royal blood and the amount of influence his presence alone would hold in the Leaf, there is not a chance in hell that our council won't try to get their claws on him, one way or the other. Gaara knitted his eyebrows in annoyance. He was banished from the Leaf and placed for execution on first sight. How could they demand his return? That is where you are wrong, Gaara. Gaara looked at her, eyes confused. Whatever do you mean? He was exiled, not banished. The Leaf regarded him as a threat that was too vulnerable if left alone back then. But seeing how the fourth seal still holds strong. Eyes widening, Gaara clenched his knuckles tight. He will no longer be perceived a threat, thereby enabling the Leaf village to call for his return. He finished contritely, earning a satisfied nod from Tsunade. This was the primary reason he hated this accursed position with a passion, well that and paperwork, but this certainly came first. Political maneuvers, backstabbing bastards, mute betrayals. He would rather crush enemies into oblivion with his trusty sand than duck his head into these acids any day, all week long. I swear, that idiot is more trouble than he is worth. Tsunade's melodic laughs hadn't annoyed anyone so much until that point in time. What the hell happened to you? Oh, for the last time. Where did that old stubborn buffoon I've known for so long hide himself? How could you act so mellow in front of that bastard? Guritsuchi, calm down. Huffing, the Kunoichi backed off with a fierce scowl. Her grandfather, the Tsuchikage, pinched his nose in exasperation. Inhaling a sharp breath, I was not acting mellow for anyone, that was just how the situation demanded me to act. This is why I keep shouting that you are nowhere near ready to be a yet young lady. Lunoki yelled, frustrated. Pink eyes rolled back, bewildered. Then please enlighten me as to what you were doing being so touchy-feely with that bastard Namikaze. Have you forgotten? Stepping forth, Lunoki did the last thing the residents of his room had ever dreamed of. Slap. She held her stinging cheek in shock, recoiling from the pure fury in his eyes. I forget nothing. He hissed, catching her shoulders in such a tight grip that it forced out an involuntary wince from the girl. Her rosy orbs turned misty, not from the pain itself, but from the deep rage that emanated deep within her own heart. Lunoki's eyes softened for a moment, he hovered up in the air to make an eye-to-eye level conversation with her. Kuretsuchi, look at me. She didn't, instead choosing to look away with a bitten lip. He forced her gaze to him with his hand, wiping her unshed tears with his thumbs. Seeing her like this up close, it allowed him to bask his heart in fond nostalgia. You're still so charismatic, just like your mother. He whispered remorsefully. His comment made her waver ever so slightly, but she dared not cry. It was unbecoming for a Kunoichi in her eyes. Naruto Namikaze is not a leaf shinobi, you must remember that. She looked at him with such hatred, Kitsuchi had half a mind to restrain her lest she lashed out at him. A sharp look from his father stopped him dead in his tracks, he stepped back with a lowered head in submission. Looking at her again, Lunoki squeezed her cheeks tenderly. What happened back then was done by Minato Namikaze, not by his son. But nothing. Lunoki cut her off, miffed. Even then, in midst of his mass slaughter, he was acting as any shinobi loyal to their village should have. As much as I loathe the very existence of that man. He spat venomously, flashes of buried memories coming forth like raging tides in his mind. I respect him for his loyalty too. Pink eyes went wide, disbelief etched all over my face. Seeing her sudden disarray, Lunoki smiled. He gave up his life on the off chance that his village might be spared from a certain calamity. He sacrificed the lives of his whole family that night. His son was made a living vessel for the Lord of Demons, the same entity his village loathed like you loathe him. His calm explanation made her lips curl thin. Remembering how they treated their own, she couldn't deny the steel required to achieve such feats, but he did all that for the leaf. Take that headband away from him, and there would never have been a yellow flash. Your grudge shouldn't be with Namikaze, it should stay with the leaf. Seeing her slumping shoulders, Lunoki knew she was conceding to the truth. Just like she should. The Kage never rallied on useless emotions, welfare of his village, and shinobi always came first and foremost. She had to learn this if she ever wanted to inherit his seat in the coming future, as he had hoped she would. An alliance with the man who has inherited that infamous potential will double our military might, may even increase it exponentially. You must look at everything rationally, child, there is everything to gain here and nothing to lose. It was rare for Kitsuchi to see his father act so gentle, but he figured it was what made these little moments even more endearing. But to actually see such a drastic effect on his hot-headed daughter was something else of itself. Sighing, it seemed as if Lunoki had sapped all energy from his granddaughter. Fine. She muttered, defeated. Seeing her acting in such stark contrast to her underlying emotions. Lunoki had never been so proud. Envisioning things was something humans did by birth, even so, Sakura had never envisioned a hidden village smack bang in the middle of a desert to be so lively. Walking through the main shopping districts, every person was covered head to toe in linen clothes so as to shade themselves from the scorching heat. The business was on full throttle, prices were sky high due to the heavy number of foreign guests exchanging currencies with them. The stands were, much to her surprise, filled with many items she hadn't thought feasible in such an arid terrain: fruits, freshly cut vegetables, cold drinks, restaurants of all shapes and sizes, you name it, and it was here. She had been rather flabbergasted to see the last person on earth gracing her doorstep, trying to wake her up for an early morning walk. What's the matter with you, Kakashi-sensei? Smiling, he ruffled his Kunoichi's hair playfully. She slapped his hand away and began working on fixing it up once again. The morning seems rather peppy for a walk, would you agree? Nodding, Sakura had to concede with the scarecrow on the point. Though it still didn't quite answer her question, but why? Feeling a small nudge on her feet, Sakura looked down to see a ball bouncing near her sandals. Sure enough, a moment later numerous kids came running out of the corner to retrieve said object. The Kunoichi smiled and tossed a ball up in her arms with a flick of her toes. Here you go. She handed it out to them. A rather small flock of children grinned, nearly taking it from her when a voice called from beside them, "What are you doing here, Haruka?" Looking aside, both leaf ninjas saw a decently aged man come and greet a little girl in the middle of all the children. "I'm playing." Her chipper tone actually made smiles break out all around the streets. Kakashi could see that they were rather caring when it came to children her age. Though, his slant eyebrow raised when he saw the icy glares being leveled at them both. "Let's go, Haruka." The man caught her arm and led her away, the girl looked back with a melancholy gaze. "But my ball," she cried. It made the man halt his steps for a moment, only for him to eye the ball in a stunned Sakura's hand, as if it had turned into garbage merely from her touch alone right before he twisted his head back to the little girl with a warm smile. "Don't worry, I'll buy you a new one. That one is dirty now." His comment shook Sakura to the core. His implication wasn't lost to her in the slightest, she had never been on the receiving end of such a venomous comment before. Every adult back home usually adored her due to her parents' heavy respect and influence. As soon as the kids had left, Kakashi looked around them in concern. It seemed as if someone had pulled an imaginary trigger of sorts, where all the chirpy-looking people had morphed and were now staring down at them in utter disdain. Nothing was physical or even verbal, though their disgusted side glances weren't lost to either of the two. "Kakashi-sensei." She whispered. Nodding, "Yeah." Kakashi affirmed. Trudging past the hostile streets, it wasn't long before incoherent whispers became audible statements right behind their backs. "Scum. Trash. Bitch. Freak." Tears stung her emerald eyes. Sakura turned around with a start to see everyone tending to their businesses, as if nothing was wrong. Thinking it was only her latent paranoia screaming for no reason other than a subtle lack of sleep, she looked aside to see her teacher too looking back with a peculiar glint in his eyes. Strange," he murmured, rubbing his chin pensively. Somehow, Kakashi felt all this to be oddly nostalgic. "My lady, I must protest against this decision. You cannot go in without protection." The rest of the words were tuned out from her mind, only a few words in between started jumbling up in the vacancies of her mind. "Lady, cannot go in without protection." Smiling sweetly, "Ow." She chimed angelically. "Yes, my lady." "Shut up or I'll kill you." Hi. Tajiro cleverly decided to stay back lest the shy swordsman be melted into oblivion. He looked at his quivering senior with a pitying look, even though he never meant it. Somehow the man had a knack for aggravating one of the most dangerous females in the elemental nations, without ever attempting to do so. Seeing her walking into the chambers with her usual lavishness, the gruff-looking man by her side grunted in utter annoyance. "What's the meaning of this?" His loud voice had absolutely no effect on the masked men guarding the door, they shook their heads dutifully. "No guards are allowed inside, only the cages have been permitted to enter." They growled, the vein on his forehead almost on the verge of popping and spewing off blood. "Blasphemy, you do not trust me," he yelled, absolutely livid at their guts. Still, the guard stood stone still. "Do you not trust the sand?" The tension in the hallways was impalpable, someone could literally prick the thick atmosphere with a pin. That is, if anyone had the guts to actually go through with it. And even A had to admit, these sand shinobi truly were baked and toughened in scorching heats to stand in front of him without even flinching an inch. "Do you not trust Lord Namikaze?" That did it. A slammed his lightning-covered fist right by the masked man's face and buried it in the wall behind him. The man still didn't budge an inch, much to his hidden ire, and continued staring on him passively through his mask. Grunting, A relented. "See, Derry, stay here." "Hi." A's shadow loomed ominously over the two Anbu. "You had better wish that master of yours a prayer for this. Had he not earned my respect back there, your heads would be mushed by now for such insubordination." His growl was followed by an ominous bang of the door, marking its cracked closing. Scooting closer, Chijiro stepped near the slack-jawed senior of his as subtly as it was humanly possible. "Those sand Anbu sure are tough to stand up to the rakeage, nah. Maybe this alliance just might be possible, won't you say so, San?" Ao nodded dumbly, having nothing else he could add to his junior's words. Not even a little comparison to his fond olden days. Jiraiya sat, eyeing the empty saucer in front of his eyes lifelessly. He dipped a finger on its rim, circling it on the saucer like a top with a vacant smile marrying his face. "I want a word with you." Glancing back, Jiraiya raised an inquisitive eyebrow. "Really?" he inquired. "Yes." Shrugging, Jiraiya went back to the task of refilling his saucer from one of the 5 nearly empty bottles of liquor, clattering his table disturbingly. "You taught the 4th, correct?" "Yeah." The man by his side smiled wickedly, almost as if he had found his golden treasure without even searching for it. "So, you know all of his techniques too?" "Yeah, all except one." His smile slipped a bit, clearly not expecting this development. "Which one?" Jiraiya chuckled, not laughing, as if he wasn't even sane anymore. "His most powerful one, the one he promised to leave only for his son." "His son?" The venom in his voice wasn't lost to Jiraiya. Even though he couldn't care less if anyone lived or died anymore, he had to take note of this. Even though he knew that. He was finished. Standing up, he inconsiderately threw some rolls of notes on the table and staggered his way out. Halting his steps for a moment, he glanced back with a knowing smile gracing his lips. "You are no match for him." His hands tightened on the edge of the table, knuckles whitening and causing the timber in their grip to shake and crack. A wash of hatred flashed all over his face, while his eyes bled crimson, 3 deadly circling madly in his eyes. Sasuke Uchiha would have everything, no matter what. The whole floor gyrated with the subtle thumps of music being played by the side. It was, after all, the last get-together for all the guests conjured up in the Sand Village before they traveled back home. The rush of this year's annual exams had all but died down, and everyone honored with the pleasure of being invited to this party was more or less content with savoring these last few moments of luxurious cordial reception before they returned to their meager lives back home. You don't look too comfortable, if you don't mind me asking. I'm comfortable. Is it the food, perhaps, not to your liking? No, it's nice. Naruto sighed for what seemed like the umpteenth time this evening. It was a given fact that since he was playing host during this gathering, he himself was accountable for making sure each of his guests were comfortable and properly taken care of. But this wasn't how he'd expected to play host. Listen, you don't have to put up a front with me just for the sake of your grandfather. I won't rat you out, I promise. His reassurance did seem to have an impact, shoulders slumping, Kuretsuchi heaved a sigh of relief. Flicking a drink from the waiter tumbling around, Naruto offered it to her courteously. Kuretsuchi, apparently not one for formalities when her host himself seemed to have no qualms with her, chugged it down in one gulp. I don't really like you all that much. Her honest confession made Naruto throw out a warm chuckle. Yeah, I figured it out a while back, you know. His comment earned him a sharp slap to the arm, courtesy of one flustered-looking Kunoichi. Why have you been hanging around me all evening then? His blunt question made her flinch, her eyes subtly darted to her back, too subtle for anyone but the keenest of eyes to have noticed. Naruto did in fact notice it and glanced back to see her grandfather's feverish eyes trained on her back in the midst of his own conversations. He put you up to this? She didn't so much as twitch, too afraid to answer honestly and get caught admitting the truth to a foreign diplomat. Naruto had indeed been wondering why this girl, one who feverishly hated his guts, had been limping by his arm all evening when she could have had better places to be, better people to associate with. Pondering over a solution, Naruto caught the barest of visages in the corner of his eyes and smiled, having come up with a suitable plan to ease up the poor girl's nerves. Offering her a hand, may I have the pleasure of a dance? Looking as if struck by acid, never. Kuretsuchi bit right back. Maybe he should have offered her ramen instead. Eyes twinkling with mischief, well, I'm glad you feel so pleased for me, I'm sure your grandfather will be too, once he gets to know how pleasant you are to me. The way her pink eyes narrowed ferociously almost made her look, dare he say, cute. Kuretsuchi instantly looped an arm around him and tugged him along the crowd, straight to the dance floor. You're the worst. She coughed out of everyone's earshot. I try, princess. Reaching the middle of the floor, Naruto settled his palm on the small of her back and smiled when she coiled her arms around his neck. Linking their fingers together, both started moving to the quiet harmonic beats of the music. Kuretsuchi, ever the rival, pushed her toe forward and scowled accusingly when he pulled back his own toe from being crushed beneath her heels. Their little battle of feet went on for a minute or so before the girl finally conceded her defeat and let her head be laid down by his hand, her cheek nestled on his shoulder to compensate for the slow music the orchestra had just tuned to now. You're an okay dancer. Knowing this was the furthest extent of a compliment he'd be getting from her tonight, Naruto took it with a smile. What can I say, I had an awesome teacher. Kuretsuchi laughed lightly, finally feeling relaxed. Thank you. She hadn't expected him to go so far just to make her feel at home. When her grandfather had forced her to make friends with Naruto, she'd feared the worst. There was nothing more she hated than an enemy country's ninja, slap on the name Namikaze to the back, and you had a winning combo that was hard to beat in her list of hate. But he had held her by his arm throughout the evening, taking every curt and cold comment she threw at him with a grain of salt. To think he'd go so far as to force her into a lovely dance just to make her feel comfortable was beyond what she'd expected from him in the wildest of her dreams, not like she was dreaming of him or anything, dang it. Why the hell was his chest so plushy, for crying out loud? Just as the music started annotating the last of its notes, Naruto took her hand and spun the girl around, earning a squeal of delight from the stone-faced Kunoichi before he pulled her back closer to him and lifted up her thigh in one swift movement. Finishing their dance by leaning her back while he pushed his weight on her, his fingers teasingly traced her thigh through the slit in her gown and smiled, seeing her flushed scowl. Told you, I've got an awesome teacher. Before she could retort with some sort of sissy reply, a round of applause broke the duo's reverie, only now did they notice that everyone's sole focus of attention was on just the two of them. Kuretsuchi made a show of fixing her gown and gave a bow, Naruto followed suit, and both got down from the floor, looking very much worse and under the weather for the wear. You're the worst. Oh, hush. You enjoyed that dance just as much as I did. That's not the point. She hissed, we're not supposed to. Naruto cut her off, we're not supposed to what? Sighing, you know, act so kind and friendly. She muttered. Naruto raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms, unimpressed. Why the hell not? He asked. You were born in the leaf, Naruto. She explained. Now you live in the sand and I'm from the hidden stone that despises the both of them. Cutting her tirade midway, it's nothing to be ashamed of, Naruto said, stopping beside her with an air of confidence. Don't just keep thinking back to where the person was born, no one has control over it. Times are changing, Kuretsuchi, and to be honest I'm hoping sand and stone will be allies in the future. Her breath hitched, clearly caught off guard. Allies? She exclaimed, flushing when she saw all eyes turning to her with amusement. I'm sorry, what? She stuttered. Naruto took a step forward, making her take one back out of sheer instincts. His aura alone was one she had never encountered before, an aura of power, of pure confidence. He wasn't even oozing the slightest bits of chakra or killing intent, and yet, as ashamed as she was to admit it, Kuretsuchi already felt dominated by his presence. You aren't ready, Kuretsuchi. Not yet, but even I can see you'll be the one who'll be named the Tsuchikage given some time to mature and grow. Naruto honestly confessed, I want us to be neutral at least, if not more. Suddenly, for some odd reason, Kuretsuchi found her heels to be an awful lot interesting. You really believe I'll be Tsuchikage? She whispered in such a small voice that Naruto had almost missed it. Believe? Naruto picked her chin up and forced her gaze to his. I know you'll be Tsuchikage, girl, a fine one at that. Flashed with one of his trademark fox-like grins, Kuretsuchi found the tips of her ear turning hot and her knees felt fuzzy. If she were to be honest, which wasn't common, she had been doubting her own worth as a candidate to that position ever since she'd seen that raw display of power back in the arenas. To think, the old man she chewed off every day, who stood on equal terms with these behemoths, had crushed her confidence in ways she absolutely did not desire. But here she was, being touted as a perfect candidate to that post by none other than Namikaze Naruto, the man who had the guts to go against the Raikage without an ounce of fear. The man she hated and, dare she say, respected and idolized from the bottom of her heart. Friends, she whispered, pushing her hand onward. I'd like that. Naruto took it and shook it firmly. I'm glad. He said, actually glad to have made at least one adversary turn into a friendship he could rely on in the future. But this wasn't right, there wasn't anything solid to reaffirm the solidarity to this newly minted bond. Just then, an idea struck him and he rummaged through his back pocket for the item. Taking her small hand in his own, with Kuretsuchi noting how rugged and assuring it felt against her own manicured ones, her hand instantly curled up into a tight fist from the unwarranted action from the blonde. Rubbing the inside of her palm in circles, Naruto eased her grip and opened her fist before closing it back down to place his kunai firmly in her hands. Let's seal it with this. He suggested, and Kuretsuchi brushed the cold steel in her palms with a forlorn look. She knew it, of course. It was a three-pronged kunai. What's this? She asked, feigning ignorance. This is my treasure, Naruto never ceased to amaze her, a kunai with a formula on it. It only works one way, of course, seeing her confused face, he elaborated, meaning it only works if someone on the other end pumps some chakra into it. You don't have to worry about me infiltrating your village or something, it is a fail-safe of sorts. If you find yourself in trouble you can't escape and have no one to rely on, just ring me up or give me a call through this. And there it was again, once more his eyes shone with that same aura of dominance she'd been enveloped in before. But the words he uttered next made her very heart shiver. I'll be there in a flash, Naruto promised, only now noticing the fear and hesitation in her eyes. But this was something she had to decide for herself, even though she knew that much, a decision that might very well shape her village's future. How many times had she heard those cursed words? It was part of a popular saying in her village, after all. The Third Great Shinobi War had left a scar too great to be filled in the hearts of her people with time. If you saw the flash, your neck would have a slash. This saying had been ingrained in her mind ever since the early days of her childhood. It was the saying that had taken 1,000 lives in a minute, her mother included after all. Everyone knew them in the stone, these kunai knives were hated with a passion back home. But to think these very knives would become a tempting offer to friendship one day, Kuretsuchi had to admit that life had a sadistic sense of humor. My village can decipher this, you know. She admitted softly, I can even call you into a trap and have you assassinated with this, her thumb lightly tracing the treasured formula perfected by the fourth Hokage. Her own heart and mind unsure on how to go about this or what exactly she was supposed to make of this unexpected offer. Why was he placing such faith in her? Then you're very welcome to try, princess. Naruto's tone was cocky, mocking almost. But this time, instead of scowling or outright biting his head off, Kuretsuchi smiled lightly. She flicked the slit of her gown to the right, exposing her naked thigh and the black belt holding a single kunai to him. Disposing off the prerequisite weapon it held in a trash can kept by her side, she tucked her new and trusted weapon safely in place. I won't tell anyone of this, I promise, your secret safe with me. She whispered, fixing her gown back in place. But why go so far for me? Aren't we supposed to be enemies? Naruto sheepishly rubbed the back of his head, why stay enemies when we can be friends? He shrugged his shoulders, winking playfully. His words marked the end of their conversation as an Anbu came by his side and whispered something in his ear, forcing said blonde to excuse himself from her. Seeing him go, Kuretsuchi couldn't help but murmur. Friends huh, she grinned like a cat, it's got a nice ring to it. Seeing him stride through the crowd like a lion of sorts, Kuretsuchi let her gaze longer on his wife and firm back for a moment too long. Were his shoulders always this broad? She hummed, I wonder. Her head tilting aside in honest confusion, she wondered if she was sick or something. Her cheek still felt hot as a volcano for some odd reason, as if she'd just spit out some lava in the aftermath to one of her techniques. Maybe, the desert heat was finally getting to her. Lifeless, wrinkled eyes watched the circling liquid rippling in his saucer, rather blankly. It had been this way ever since he'd come to the sand, a decision he knew his heart would regret until the day he'd die. This was how it was supposed to be, wasn't it? The likes of a legendary ninja like him are reduced to living his aging years as a failure, drinking his years away. Is this seat taken? Looking up at the annoying voice that had just broken his peaceful trance, Jiraiya squinted his eyes to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. I've got only one spot left, tell the other three to find someplace else. He grumbled, downing yet another saucer before pouring it full for another round, signaling the waiter for another bottle yet again. How many bottles has it been, already? None of your damn business, that's how many. The small, soft hand met his cheek for an audible smack, one that left his eyes twinkling and mind spinning with a sheer grunt put behind it. You never take that tone with me. Drunk or otherwise, understand. Just who do you think is lecturing me? The annoying voice cut him off, the last person who truly cares about your well-being, Jiraiya. Your trusted teammate, that's who I think I am. Tsunade, is that you? Yes, silly. She giggled, it's me, who else? I don't think Orochimaru of all people would visit you in broad daylight on a whim. The effect of alcohol instantly flushed itself out of his system, and Jiraiya's vision sharpened to see the woman he could never get sitting there in all her glory, sipping on some tea. Would you come here, Tsunade? Don't you have better places to be? Better people to meet in that party? He scoffed haughtily, trying and failing miserably to put up a mighty front and save some face, at least in front of her. Jiraiya, it isn't even time for supper, and you can't even count people with your eyes. What's gotten into you, huh? You're ruining your life. Oh ho. Jiraiya exclaimed, faking a laugh. Is that concern I hear? Jiraiya. Tsunade sighed. Well, I'll be damned. He laughed boisterously. Never thought the day would come when you'd come to see me in a time of peril, the legendary Kunoichi Senju Tsunade. I must admit, I'm honored. He stumbled a bow. It was at this moment that the waiter chose to make his presence known. Sir, your bottle. Before Jiraiya's fingers or the timber of their table could so much as touch the porcelain of this bottle, Tsunade snatched the annoying thing away and slammed Jiraiya's saucer right back on the waiter's tray. Take it away, she snapped, he'll have a coffee, black. Before he could so much as utter a word of protest, Tsunade raised her hand chidingly and shut Jiraiya up like a mother would do to her child. We'll have a decent conversation like two responsible adults, it's about damn time you came down from your high and back to your senses. Even if she was at odds with him, he was still her teammate and friend. How many times had he come through for her in her times of need? That's the point, Tsunade, Jiraiya growled, I don't want to come to my senses. Tsunade's eyes softened, why not, Jiraiya? She asked tenderly. Don't take that tone with me, Jiraiya thundered, and out went the tenderness from her eyes, I don't want your pity. He roared loudly. Alright, she whispered. He scoffed, fine. There was a moment of silence as Jiraiya's eyes clouded up in nostalgia. You know something, Tsunade. I idolized Sensei more than anyone in the village, he confessed in a drunken stupor, clearly beyond his senses. Tsunade hummed, intrigued, I know. That time, when I returned to the village a month before the finals of the exams were about to happen, you wanna know what he told me? Jiraiya sniffled, forcing Tsunade to give his hand an assuring squeeze, and urged him to go on. It was high time he let this out and finally told her the truth he'd been running from all this time. He told me Naruto had even more potential than he'd seen in either Orochimaru, Minato and even Itachi. Then, Sensei even went on to tell me he'd have taken Naruto in as his apprentice had he not been Hokage. You should have seen how he looked at the boy, Tsunade. It was like he was a blood relative of his own. It wasn't his words that surprised her, it was the tone laced with pure venom that did Tsunade's composure in. Yeah, he really loved the kid. Tsunade agreed, smiling fondly. No, hear me out, Jiraiya intervened. He said it would be nice to leave behind at least one student who wasn't a complete failure in his eyes. Jiraiya laughed out loud and Tsunade was forced to duck her head in shame. How many times had Hiruzen called her back in times of need? Every time, she'd answered his calls with curses and swears to the village. She knew they ached his heart, stabbed him with pain every time she let her hostility for the leaf bare-boned right in front of him. But the man had always smiled, even helped her with money-related matters whenever she'd needed his assistance, in hopes that maybe, just maybe someday she'd come around and see the light at the end of the metaphorical tunnel. Unfortunately, by the time she'd come to her senses, his corpse had already been cold in the grave while the village was left in tatters. He told me the kid had learned a forbidden Jonin technique in a couple of hours. This was the first Tsunade was hearing of it, so she leaned forward in interest. I chugged it down as an over-exaggerated praise, of course. But he wouldn't hear any of it. You should have seen him, the man looked possessed. Before Tsunade could get a word off her lips, then, I took Naruto on that trip to find you. It was then that I saw what Sensei had seen all those years ago. The raw potential, a legend in the making. Kid nearly mastered the Rasengan, a technique that took Minato 3 years to complete and 6 months for me to learn in a mere month. He was a diamond in the rough, with the correct assistance I knew he was destined to take Sensei's and Minato's place someday then and there. Her mouth opened and closed a couple of times, and she narrowed her eyes in deep contemplation. This was finally the time he was letting the cat out of the bag, finally admitting the truths. Then what happened? Then, Jiraiya chugged down the remainder of sake from his old bottle and swiped the drops with the back of his palm. Sasuke went AWOL. Tsunade quieted down completely, letting him push everything out and tell her why the hell he'd gone on and betrayed the boy who he had such high hopes for, the boy who he spoke for with such pride and admiration. I honestly believed he'd fail. Sasuke would go to Orochimaru in search of power, and I'd take him out on a trip to train and keep Akatsuki off his tracks. That was the plan, back then at least. Would you do it, Jiraiya? Tsunade whispered, would you betray him? She couldn't help but ask the question eating away at her soul. Because he succeeded. Jiraiya thundered as if the devil himself was upon him, he even succeeded where I failed. How the hell could he bring Sasuke back? Tsunade's eyes widened, all blocks in her mind clicking. You were jealous of him? She asked him as if he were ridiculous. Of course I was jealous. He huffed, and she didn't know if he was just drunk or plain old stupid right now. When he was in the hospital, that Hyuga chick would come daily to leave some flowers. A princess adored him, Tsunade. He had the genes and lineage of his parents, an untapped potential no one could hope to achieve given the proper guidance. You see where I'm going with this, he was a carbon copy of me, just a bit more imperfect and completely in reverse. He succeeded at everything I'd failed. Naruto brought back Sasuke where I failed to bring back Orochimaru. He had the love of a princess, when I failed so much as to get a glance from the woman I loved. Tsunade looked away at that. Even the toads liked him more than me and Minato combined. Anta said he was too stupid and gutsy, but they loved him. Plus, he had the makings of a perfect sage. Jiraiya crushed the bottle in his palms with a distinct shatter of glass and porcelain. So, when the villagers turned on him for bruising up the Uchiha, I let them be. A lone tear slipped past his cheek and Jiraiya hid his face in the palms of his hands. God knows I wanted to help him, but something dark bubbled up in my chest and I just wanted him to take it. He spat bitterly, I wanted him to feel the burden of my failures, the loneliness of a friend's betrayal and the path of solitude that I've endured on my travels. He made a motion of his neck being sliced and spoke and smiled evilly, so, I sided with the villagers instead of him and cut off his contact with the toads. Told them that he was a traitor to the village and got his contract completely annulled. He nearly cried towards the end. I took away everything from him and left him with nothing. Tsunade herself was openly crying now, to think she herself had a part in making Jiraiya fall so far was utterly painful and agonizing at the same time. Jiraiya, she honestly didn't have any words to explain her predicament right now, I'm the true demon, aren't I, Tsunade? Jiraiya, Tsunade didn't even have enough words left to console him right now. Whether the reason was hatred, pity or remorse she'd never know. Minato and Kushina left me in charge of their legacy, their baby. Sarutobi-sensei entrusted me with the care of nurturing one of his soldiers and training the villagers. He was my godson, my responsibility for God's sake, and I pushed him out of his home and kicked him to the wolves. Jiraiya slammed his fist on the table and webbed a link of cracks in it in despair. Why didn't you say something sooner, Jiraiya? What was I to say? He chuckled lifelessly. And who was I to tell? Tsunade had absolutely no answer to that. You could have told me. Tsunade blinked, realizing it definitely wasn't Jiraiya's voice she was hearing since it was so feminine. Jiraiya blinked, realizing it definitely wasn't Tsunade's voice he was hearing even in this drunken stupor. Both turned around as one, seeing a girl with hip-length blonde hair straightened out on her back standing there with a white free-flowing gown hugging her curves. Temari, Tsunade whispered in distress. Of all the people, it had to have been her. How much did you hear? Jiraiya asked with a wince, realizing the true extent of his actions for the night as the alcohol in his system was all but gone right now. Enough, she answered curtly, her stance firm and cool. I came to escort you back to the party, Lady Tsunade. She said calmly. Listen, about what you just heard. Jiraiya started to try and explain his side of the story. But, when he saw her cross her arms beneath her bosoms as her teal greens narrowed in on him, words left his throat. Jiraiya, Temari sighed and ignored the formality of honorifics. I honestly cannot care less about what you said right now. I don't even know what to think about you right now. So, for now, let's just forget this ever happened and return to our lives. Jiraiya stayed silent and let her say whatever she wished for. Temari honestly could have cursed him to her heart's desire, and he wouldn't have retorted to even a single word of it. But he knew she wouldn't stoop to do something so low and disgusting. She was above all this, after all, she wasn't like him. She was the girl who held Naruto's heart in the palm of her hands, after all. That will be for the better. I suppose Jiraiya agreed and stumbled by her side. Just as he was about to pass her, he stopped and looked at her. Temari didn't even bat an eyelash when he tried to touch her cheek with his finger, only for her to take a step back and stare at him quietly to see what it was that he wanted. You're a great girl, Temari. He acknowledged, you've got the same sass coupled with the soft side Kushina once did. Take care of him for me, will you? Temari stayed quiet for a moment, but after thinking about it, I'll always be there for him, she said quietly. But not for you, for myself. Regardless, thank you. Temari watched him trudge out of the bar with a firm gaze, but her heart went out for the man whose walk held none of the composure a legendary ninja like him should have held. Just as he was about to leave Jiraiya, she called out to him. Said man stopped and looked at her in surprise. Temari turned her gaze to Tsunade and motioned for them to come a bit closer. There's a tradition in the sand, she started quietly, honestly confused if she should be doing this with them or not. Elders are supposed to give their children something, anything, to impart their young ones with blessings and keep evil eyes away from the shadows of their children. Temari opened up one of her palms and kept the other one on her stomach. I've got neither a mother nor a father, neither does Naruto. So, it's only right I get something for this young one to impart to him with an elder's blessings. She whispered, looking down. What Jiraiya stammered, child, what child? Where is he? Tsunade tugged his sleeve, wide-eyed, Temari, are you? Yes, she affirmed, I'm pregnant. Lord, have mercy on me. Tsunade squealed in delight, how long? 1 week. Tsunade went forward to inspect her stomach and diagnose her, but Temari stepped back, palms still outstretched impatiently. Don't get me wrong, Lady Tsunade. Naruto may trust you, but you're still a medical ninja from an allied village. You get the gist, right? She asked icily. Tsunade smiled tightly, knowing full well what she meant. Being a medical ninja of her caliber, it wasn't out of Tsunade's skill to perform an abortion with the slightest of touches, and she had even seen the girl try and keep her distance in the house without making Naruto realize it. She hadn't hoped Temari would outright trust her, but Tsunade had hoped she at least had a little faith in her. My gift, Temari, asked for the final time. Tsunade hurried through her blouse and took out her wallet, instantly emptying everything above the denomination of 100 in her palms. Thank you, Temari nodded and turned to Jiraiya with an impatient tap of her foot. Are you going to hand me something, or not? She asked. As if someone had pricked him with a pin, Jiraiya shivered, oh of course, he nearly cried in joy. The news still hadn't seeped in enough, Naruto was going to become a father. Minato and Kushina were going to be grandparents, and Temari was willing to at least let him impart his blessings onto their unborn infant. He slid his hands all over his torso, his fingers tracing the black thread hung around his neck like a feather. Jiraiya plucked the necklace off, brushing the crimson ruby shaped into a spiral with a forlorn smile. This was Kushina's, he admitted softly, tracing the jewel as if it were the most precious thing in the world. That's all I have for now, Temari. Please accept it. The girl graciously took it with both her palms and clutched it to her chest with a warm smile. Thank you. Tsunade cupped the girl's head in her palms and pulled her blushing face down to plant a kiss on her forehead. Life is a flame that is always burning itself out, but it catches fire again every time a child is born. My grandmother used to preach me this when I was little. Maybe they'll revigor a new flame for this child too. It's truly a new era, Temari. Jiraiya took it as his cue to leave and tried as he might to stop his face from wrinkling up while he bawled his eyes out in front of two ladies. Master Jiraiya, Temari called before he left, again, I'll see you at the baby shower, right? Her eyes turned to Tsunade, the both of you? Of course, Tsunade chirped up almost instantly and looked behind to see Jiraiya leaning by the door with an arm as if he'd just been through war. He started leaving without a word, but both women heard a choked sob. Jiraiya, will you accompany me? Tsunade asked again. This was the only chance at redemption he might ever receive, but it was his call. Tsunade knew it. Even Jiraiya knew it. Jiraiya raised up his free hand with a chuckle, I won't miss it for the world. With that said, Jiraiya walked out to find himself a bathhouse before he went to a shrine and finally made a trip to the cemetery back in the Leaf. Someone had to give news to Minato and Kushina, after all. Maybe, just maybe he could redeem his fallen self after all. Otherwise, hell was what awaited him. Lemon ahead, but I urge you to read it. It is relevant, but you've been warned. White mist covered the room like a thin veil. Most would be hesitant to say that the visibility was favorable, but the man and woman inside were accustomed to this atmosphere and could see without any obstructions. Sasuke-kun, a soft voice purred yes. Sasuke licked the valley of her breasts enticingly, slowly but surely grazing his teeth on her skin. The girl winced a little, but continued to moan when she took her breasts and roughly massaged them. He proceeded to take a pert nipple in between his lips, she whimpered when his teeth circled around the appendage while he started biting away over it savagely. She continued to scream as he kept sucking and biting away at her nipple like a beast while his hand traveled down south, right in between her thighs. Sasuke slowly moved his mouth up from her chest and kissed her mouth, dipping his tongue into her hot mouth as a battle of tongues ensued, all the while 3 of his fingers tried to work his way inside her. Clenching her nose in a pinch, Sasuke kissed her so roughly the girl nearly lost her breath. Sasuke. Her whimper made him groan. Clenching the flesh of her neck in his teeth, say it. Sasuke grunted. Sasuke-kun, I want you. Slapping her hard, what did I tell you to say? He growled. Tears of fright rolled down her cheeks, Sasuke-kun, I love you. I love you with all my heart, but I can't take it anymore. She was almost afraid to say the next part but went on anyway, I need you now. Your wish is my command. Sasuke rose up from her slender form and positioned his member in front of her entrance with one swift movement. She cried out in shock and pain, nearly unbelieving that making love could ever be this harsh. Slowly he started to thrust in and out, in and out. Before, without any warning, Sasuke started picking up the pace and continued groaning. The girl tried to keep up with the pace, but failed miserably. He was going too fast, Sasuke-kun, slow down please. She whimpered. His rock-hard shaft hilted with each thrust, hitting her walls repeatedly with an audible smack. It wasn't long before her walls tightened up and she started to bleed. Ow, Sasuke. She cried, please, stop. You're hurting me. Her wails fell on deaf ears as he continued to pound into her while she held onto the sheets for dear life and waited for this nightmare to just end. Without even removing himself, Sasuke flipped her into a puppy position and continued his assault with the same ferocity. The force itself was so great that his partner kept hitting her head on the headboard of the bed repeatedly, I'm near the end. With one last thrust, he came inside her while the girl collapsed on the bed with a sniffle. Her heartbeat calmed down and she curled up into a little ball as he pulled out of her. Sasuke sat with her, tangled in the sheets for about 5 minutes before cleaning himself off and started putting on his clothes. Walking out to the living room, Sasuke looked back, annoyed that she was still following him around like a puppy. Where are you going, Sasuke-kun? Sakura, it was a good session, but you know I have to go. We've been over this 1,000 times already, if anyone catches us together it won't look good on me. I've got a reputation to uphold, unlike you. Oh of course. She whispered. Tomorrow, before leaving, try and steer Naruto away from you-know-who. Make up with him and keep up public appearances and I swear you'll have proven your love and loyalty to me. Next time he goes off on his own, my mission will finally come to fruition. But that said, Sasuke left a naked Sakura whimpering in the living room. Little did he know that the couple had an audience waiting in hiding for them. Sakura was so engrossed in the pain she felt that she didn't feel any presence behind her until it was too late. She turned around, only to see the hilt of a sword making its way to the side of her temple. Gaara's time at the party had been uninteresting so far. Apart from making small talk with more of the fellow cages, there hadn't been anything eventful for him in this gathering thus far. Just as he was about to make his way and talk to Naruto about how the talks with Kuretsuchi had proceeded, a man cloaked in a dark black shroud was in front of him. Gaara didn't need to ask to know that this was the official to his Anbu. Lord Kazekage, he bowed dutifully, Lord Naruto wishes for your presence in the back of the administrative tower. Eyebrows quivering in surprise, what's that idiot up to this time? He sighed seeing Naruto walk out with an Anbu just at the same time. 2 more Anbu flanked his back while their leader motioned for him to follow him outside. I don't need so many escorts, you know. Lord Naruto's orders, we cannot disobey Lord Fifth. Gaara walked with the silent trio out in the village before they took to the roof and made their way back to the Kazekage tower. The Anbu jumped down in the barren lawns of the building while Gaara looked around, unimpressed, where's Naruto? Is this some sort of a joke? Not at all, the Anbu leader said, we just wanted to have a private time with you, that's all. His partner chuckled before taking his mask off. Gaara's eyes narrowed when his eyes were greeted with blue flesh instead of a normal human skin, while the man grinned with his shark-like teeth, as if he'd made some sort of a joke. His own eyes turned to the second flanking Anbu who took his mask off only for Gaara to gaze into the accursed crimson eyes of the ancient shinobi clan. Ashigaki kiss him, Ichiha Itachi, he muttered, annoyed, the Akatsuki. Oh ho, Kisum laughed, you know us already, I must say I'm honored. Lord Kazukiage, Itachi said, ignoring his partner's useless bumbles, we wish for you to come with us, peacefully. You've got some nerve to order me around, in a desert no less. Gaara said, calm as a cucumber. He turned around to look at the final one. And you, the third musketeer. Who the hell are you? Identify yourself. Me? The last one took off his mask and said a name that made Gaara's blood run cold. I'm Uzumaki. Uzumaki Nagato. A soft tune broke into the light lilting air as Temari stretched her body upwards and extended an arm to grab a pack of tea from the top shelf. The mellow beams of sunlight accentuated the glow on her cheeks as the balls of her feet danced over the wooden floor with customary elegance and felicity, the tip-taps of her toes in sync with the tune she was crooning. The scent of tea leaves brew wafted through the air as she went toward some sugar when, suddenly, a pair of arms grabbed hold of her and stopped her from dancing. Naruto pressed his lips to Temari's ear and kissed it tenderly, enveloping Temari in that tender hug of his from behind that always made her feel mushy. Someone's in a good mood today. He whispered. Temari smiled as she laid her cheek against his shoulder and started swaying in his arms, she hummed. Both savored in the serenity of the moment when Naruto started matching her movements and swayed left and right to her hums. What's got you in such a good mood? Naruto asked after a few minutes of dancing. Temari didn't answer him. Too engrossed was she in her own little world. The sunlight struck the pendant on Temari's chest and bounced off the gem in the middle. Its gleam caught Naruto's eye. He slid his finger along the black thread tied around her neck and traced its length lightly, his smile widening when Temari's breath hitched as little as he went lower and lower until his finger reached the ruby pendant. Carved into a familiar little spiral it was. As it rested in his palm, Naruto took his time to appreciate the craftsmanship. That's one exquisite necklace. He murmured thoughtfully, smiling. He let go off the pendant and squeezed her waist tenderly. You've been busy spending my hard-earned money, I see. He said, chuckling a little towards the end. Temari said nothing, instead, she wrapped her arms around his neck and turned around in his arms. Do you like it? She asked. Yes, it's beautiful, Naruto whispered. Temari opened her eyes a little to see him staring not at the necklace, but at her. She squeezed her eyes shut in embarrassment and the tips of her ears turned hot. Naruto chuckled when she nuzzled her nose in his neck to hide her face. Idiot, she muttered, smacking his chest lightly. Are you free tonight? Her question caught Naruto by surprise. He thought about it for a second. I suppose, he replied, rubbing her arm gently. Did you have something in mind for tonight? He asked. I do. Temari nodded. What is it? It's a surprise that will blow your socks off, mister, Temari said, grinning like the Cheshire Cat. He playfully pinched her nose. Keeping surprises from me, are you? Naruto asked. Temari drew circles on his chest with her finger and chewed on her lip. It's important, she whispered. Naruto raised her chin up with his thumb, with worry in his eyes. Hey, he said in a cooing voice, what's got you looking so worried? Tell me. Temari shook her head. Not now tonight, she said resolutely. Naruto turned off the stove and pulled her head back against his shoulder. Alright then, he said. Promise me that you'll be home tonight, Temari whispered. Won't miss it for the world, he promised. There was a knock to the door that drew the couple's attention. I'll go get it, Naruto said, not bothering to hide the subtle annoyance lacing his words. Opening the door, Naruto was greeted with the familiar, sparsely painted face of his brother-in-law. Kankuro. Morning, Kankuro said. Naruto nodded and motioned for him to come inside, but Kankuro shook his head. I'm here on official business. Can you get Temari for me? What official business is that? One that I haven't sanctioned. Kankuro sighed. Your protectiveness of my sister is endearing and all. But I really need Temari's help on this one. Naruto had the decency to rub his neck in embarrassment on hearing that. Help. Temari walked out the door and stood beside Naruto. With what? She asked. There's this Kunoichi who's been apprehended on grounds of suspicious behavior by the Anbu. But she isn't willing to cooperate with anyone, that is, anyone besides you, Kankuro explained, not unwilling to meet Naruto's suspicious stare even for a second. Temari's brows furrowed in slight confusion. That's odd, she murmured. Who's Kunoichi? Naruto asked. Kankuro looked Naruto in the eyes. I can't answer, he said after a moment's deliberation. Which village is she from? He pressed on. I can't answer. Temari's frown became a bit more pronounced as she silently watched it back and forth between them. Kankuro. She whispered worriedly when Naruto took a hold of her hand and gave it a firm squeeze to stop her from interfering. Why can't you answer me, Kankuro? I can't answer. This is my last question, and you will answer me. Did Gaara sanction this arrest? Naruto asked firmly. Kankuro knew from the hard tone that he wasn't getting out of this without an answer. No, he begrudgingly admitted. Temari took a step closer to keep her husband from blowing up at her brother. Naruto took a deep breath and pinched his nose with a sigh. Then, on whose authority was she? Mine, Kankuro answered before he could finish asking the question. Naruto slowly unwound his arm from Temari's grip and gave her a reassuring smile. He took a couple steps closer and stood within arm's length of Kankuro. His tall form towered over the puppeteer like a mountain shadowing a plain. You do realize that this reckless arrest can turn into an international disaster, right? Naruto asked in a low voice. Seeing Kankuro's hesitant nod, Naruto poked his chest with his finger. I'm giving you full authority, just this once. I won't ask you anything else, just don't make me clean up your mess afterwards. Thank you, Naruto, Kankuro murmured out of Temari's earshot. Naruto walked back and circled an arm around Temari's waist. I'll make sure she's with you in an hour. I'd prefer not to waste our tea, Naruto told him. Kankuro opened his mouth to refute, but seeing Naruto's mischievous look and Temari's fond smile, he knew he wasn't winning this argument. Fine. Just have her be there on time, will you? He grunted and walked off the premises. Naruto walked inside and Temari closed the door behind them, leaning her back against the door. Why didn't you ask him more forcefully? She asked. Don't you remember what he said? He said, and seeing her adorably confused expression, he added, he said I can't answer. To all my questions. And that, even as a hint, is a dangerous thing to say. He knew I was questioning him as a superior, and yet, even though it could become dangerous for him, he continued saying so. Whatever intel he has on this, he'll only share with you. And I trust my wife enough to make the right decision with whatever it is Kankuro. This was all Naruto could add before Temari closed the distance between them and hugged him. I love you, she whispered. Naruto wrapped his arms around her and kissed the top of her head. I love you too, princess. Just remember to call me if things go down south. I'm always here for you, and even if you find yourself too deep in something unofficial, just talk to me, alright? He said. Temari nodded and smiled against his chest. She pecked his lips lightly and broke free from the hug, leading him back to the dining room by his hand. The tea, unfortunately, was never served. The darkness in the room did nothing to alleviate the redness in Sakura's eyes. The well-kempt pink hair she frequently flaunted was ratty. And unlike the innocuous warmth and cool shade she was accustomed to, the torrid heat of the desert made her skin clammy. Sakura was thankful for the silence in the cell. As she sat, knees to her chest and tears in her eyes, the tranquil silence allowed her to search deeper inside her soul. She had seen her love, Sasuke, cold and distant many times before, but last night his actions and his words had taken even her by surprise. She had given him everything she had to give, heeded his every beck and call like a loyal wife, but it wasn't enough, it was never enough. Sakura knew now that, even through those countless passionate nights of love, his heart had never been hers. She had merely been a pawn, a piece whose use was now nearing an end. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The truth had been in front of her all this time, but she had always turned a blind eye to it. Sasuke's ambitions were too large for her to live up to, his thirst for revenge too much to quench with only her love. And this time, his ambitions were going to destroy a family. The iron gate creaked and broke the silence when the masked guard held it open for her two visitors. The guard switched on the lights for the first time today, and Sakura had to squint her eyes and hide her face behind her hand to escape the searing light that momentarily blinded her eyes. Sakura. Temari slowly came closer to the girl. Careful, Kankuro murmured from behind. As usual, his sister paid no heed to his words and knelt in front of the girl. Sakura brushed away some of the hairs covering her eyes and smiled toothily. Veins were prominent in the whites of her eyes. The tear marks that covered her swollen cheeks gave Temari enough reason to assume that the girl had been crying for quite a while now. You came to see me, Temari. I'm glad, Sakura whispered. Temari did not know what came over her when she cupped Sakura's cheek. Maybe it was the lost look in her eyes. Or was it the swollen cheeks she wanted to caress? Perhaps, even her own primitive motherly instincts were to blame for the strange affection she showed to Sakura. What happened to you? Temari rubbed her cheek with her thumb. Seeing her eyes filled with worry, Sakura circled her arms around Temari's neck and put her weight onto the blonde. Temari tumbled down on her buttocks and enveloped Sakura in a hug. Sakura's soft mumbles were almost incoherent to Temari, but calmly did she sound devastated. Are you alright? Were the first words Temari was able to make out from the countless others Sakura sobbed. Temari rubbed Sakura's back soothingly and lightly smoothed out her messy pink hair. Me? Temari nearly giggled, I should be asking you the same, silly. Temari turned her head to see Kankuro eyeing her with disapproval, clearly not fond of the affection his sister was showering over his suspect. The blonde frowned at her brother and gave him a look that demanded he stay put, and stay put he did. Did Sasuke meet you? Sakura whispered between her sobs. Temari stiffened from her words before going back to brushing Sakura's hair when the girl clutched at her waist tighter, clearly afraid that the blonde would push her away without an answer. "No, I haven't met Sasuke," Temari confessed. "Then Kami," Sakura murmured in her neck, her breaths evening out a little. Pankuro was stiff as a board behind Temari's back, his nails biting painfully into his arms. "I knew it," he muttered to himself. It eased his heart a little that his suspicions hadn't been unfounded, but that same hunch worried him too. Being a regular participant in the Anbu's interrogation corps gave him an insight far keener than most, and the subtle glances Sasuke kept shooting his sister with throughout his stay irked the puppeteer in all the wrong ways. Neither were the looks leering, nor were they lustful. They were sharp, attentive, even. As if they were taking note of his sister's every move, watching her every step. The implications as to what those looks could mean in the grand scheme of things made the hairs on Kankuro's neck stand on ends. "What happened to you, Sakura?" Kankuro paced back and forth in the cell. Temari felt Sakura go still in her arms. She looked back to see Kankuro's eyes trained on the girl like a hawk. She wasn't nearly as oblivious as to not realize what her brother was trying to do. He was trying to wear Sakura's vulnerable mind down until the girl spilled everything he wanted to know. Temari pushed back Sakura lightly and held her hands in her own. She looked at the girl's body from top to bottom. Temari's eyes got narrower and narrower the lower they went. Sakura squirmed a little when she realized that the disheveled kimono was not hiding her skin that well and that the blonde's eyes were trained intently at the scars on her thighs. Temari lightly traced the bruised skin on Sakura's thighs and her face contorted in anguish when Sakura shamefully slapped her hand away with a soft whimper. Temari's throat became dry as the desert, seeing the face of her brother when she looked behind and saw the look of utter contempt Kankuro had shot Sakura. She looked back at Sakura and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Did Sasuke do this to you?" she asked as kindly and softly as was humanly possible. Sakura's lips parted to reply, but no words came out of him. The lump in her throat became even more pronounced. She covered her mouth with her hand to try and stop the sobs, but all her attempts were futile. Temari held her trembling shoulders firmly, as if the girl would shatter into a million little pieces the moment she'd let go. "Don't listen to her, Temari. My Anbu were watching them." Kankuro's words seemed to make Sakura look even smaller and frailer. This whore was enjoying. Kankuro's head jerked to the side as Temari's palm met his cheek in a tight slap. Kankuro caressed his stinging cheek and looked at his sister with wide eyes. Temari's body was trembling in rage. Kankuro closed his eyes, fully expecting another slap when Temari raised her hand once more. The blow never came, and Kankuro opened his eyes to see his elder sister holding a warning finger at his nose. "Not another word," she warned him in a low voice. Temari gracefully sat on her knees and looked at Sakura kindly. "Does it hurt when you sit?" she asked. "A little." Sakura nodded timidly. "Get a female medic in here," Temari told the puppeteer in a stern voice. There was no room for argument left in her tone. Kankuro clenched his knuckles till they turned white and turned to the guard outside. "Get us a medic," he begrudgingly ordered the guard outside, who looked stupefied even with his mask. "Sir? She's a prisoner, you can't be serious." The utter humiliation and frustration coupled with the sting he was still feeling from the slap he'd just been struck with made Kankuro pull open the gate and smack the guard multiple times on his head with the papers in his hand as he barked, "Didn't you hear what she just said? Bet the girl a damn medic." The poor guard turned tail and scurried off as if the devil himself was upon him. "Thank you," Sakura said gratefully. "Don't thank me," Temari said with a smile, "there are things I cannot forgive as a woman." Sakura turned her gaze down of her lap and grabbed the edge of her kimono. "You are really kind and strong, Temari. I can see why everyone regards you so highly," she admitted wistfully. "Why did you want to see me in person, Sakura?" Temari asked. Sakura looked up with a hint of determination in her eyes. "I have to tell you something," she said. "What is it?" "I really love Sasuke." Sakura took a deep breath to keep her voice strong. "I really thought I could change him if I loved him with all my heart. But I've failed, Temari. Sasuke is too far gone now. I cannot drive him off the path he has chosen, but I won't stand aside and see him destroy someone's family, either." Temari gulped thickly. The question she already knew the answer to was on her lips. "Whose family?" she asked fearfully. Sakura didn't say anything, but her silence said everything. Temari steeled her heart and asked in a firm voice, "Tell me everything, Sakura."